Okay. What I want to do is basically talk on this theme, Pupil Premium and what works. Let's make sure you can see it. And what I'm going to do is based on the evaluation we did for DFE, which was published round about this time last year. And what I'm really interested in, I'll talk you through those issues, and I'll talk you through what seemed to me to be some of the wider implications of what we found. There's two things to say. One is that the report is available, it's still on the web. DFE has a nasty habit of burying things somewhere deep in its website. This one is relatively easy to get hold of. What I'm going to say, but when you read it, you'll find it actually quite hard going, kind of disentangling the mass of evidence and all the nuances that have to be put in there and the caveats that have to be put in. What I'm going to do is, if you like, give you a bare bones story from the inside, which I think is somewhat starker than we were actually able to write in the report. So that's one thing. Then the second thing is, although the research was only published a year ago, this was a new initiative then, and things have moved on since then. So I'll tell you what it was like during 2012-13, what we found things to be like then. I'd be very interested in hearing whether you think things have actually changed. And if they have changed for the better, or have they changed for the worse? So some of the concerns I have about how the Pupil Premium policy was being implemented, you might tell me, no, actually we've got it all sorted out now. That's entirely possible, but that's what I'm going to do. And the other thing is, my email address is on there, so that is if you do want to contact, that is the place to contact. Are the slides going out to?
Yes, they'll all be on the website.
Right, so if you don't get it down now, you will be able to get it at some point. Okay. With that in mind, let's crack on a little bit. Pupil Premium, let's remind ourselves what the policy was supposed to be about. Because one of the things we found was that in the original kind of policy texts are introducing the policy, they seem to be pointing in one direction, but when the policy was implemented, and in particular when Ofsted got hold of it, it seemed to start pointing in a somewhat different direction. So the original thinking was this, that it was aimed at tackling underlying inequalities between children eligible for free school meals and their peers. Well, that stayed pretty much the same. I mean, the group was expanded somewhat. But there is an issue I want to pick up about whether children entitled to free school meals as a whole group is a sensible group to be targeting if what you're interested in is, as in my work, educational disadvantage. We'll come on to that shortly. The policy then said school leaders should decide. Well, again, there's an issue about the extent to which, in practice, school leaders were actually able to decide, or whether what happened was that they had complete freedom to decide what they wanted, provided it was in accordance with what Ofsted thought Pupil Premium should be about. And again, I'd be interested in whether you think that's changed. There was to be accountability in three ways. One, through the performance tables, and an attempt to make them clarify that within those tables what was happening to kids entitled to free school meals, through Ofsted inspections and the incorporation of Pupil Premium as a focus within inspections, and then interestingly through reports for parents and the requirement that schools should put an account of their Pupil Premium policy on the web, on the assumption that parents would read that and would then somehow engage with the school, and that would be an additional and rather interesting form of accountability. And then again, just to remind you of the figures, at the time we did the thing, the report, the initial funding had been £488 per pupil to 2011 to 12. In the year where we were doing most of our work, it was £623 per pupil, with a projection that it would increase substantially thereafter. And I believe there's now a further increase planned. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, a decent chunk of money, but I want to come back and say some more about the money as we go through. And I think what also at the time, well, I think there are two things that about the context that are important. One is that, of course, following the 2008 financial crisis, by the time Pupil Premium was being introduced, there were significant cuts to public services generally. And while in one sense the education budget was protected, it was the school's budget that was protected, and other aspects of the education budget were not protected, and certainly not protected were all those non-education services on which schools tended to rely. So the context was that the external environment was getting poorer at the same time as schools were getting this money in. So there was that issue. And also what was happening at the time was an attempt, which has been parked subsequently, as I understand it, to create a national funding formula. And I think somewhere deep in the bowels of Sanctuary Building, the plan probably was to create a flat, or a more or less flat national funding formula, and then use Pupil Premium as the one differential for funding schools differently. And they kind of found that too complicated. So I'm not quite clear what's happened to that attempt, except it did get parked at one point. Probably no bad thing, but we'll come back to that. So here's our evaluation, called, imaginatively, Evaluation of Pupil Premium, led by a team, and if you're wanting to search for it, the first named author is Hannah Carpenter. And basically consisted of a large-scale questionnaire survey of schools nationally, which tells you some things but doesn't get very far beneath the skin of what's happening. And to get beneath the skin, we also did case studies of 34 schools. My involvement in it was mainly around the case study aspect of this work, and I think that's why I have particular views as to what was actually going on, because we were able to really get deep into the complexity of what it was that schools were doing and why they were doing things. But we also did some financial analysis, and we looked at the budgets of a sample of schools, and we kind of looked at where they were in 2010, and then tracked through as Pupil Premium was introduced as to what had happened to their budgets and what had happened with the other financial changes that were going on at the same time. So we'd be reasonably happy to defend this as a fairly robust study of what was going on round about 2012-13 in terms of Pupil Premium. Okay, so far? Good, because if you'd said no, there's nothing I can do, I'm just going to do it anyway. Right, so let me try and talk you through what the key findings were at that time, and then after that to try and think through, well, what are the big underlying issues that don't just apply in 2012-13 or even in 2013-14, but are likely to be with us for some time in terms of how you fund schools to respond to educational disadvantage. So the first one is this. There was, if you looked at all the kind of policy chatter that was going on as Pupil Premium was introduced, the impression was given that the Pupil Premium was new money, that schools would have additional monies over and above everything else that they had previously received, in order to begin doing something that presumably they hadn't actually thought of doing before, which was to address educational disadvantage. What we found when we looked in the detail of schools' budgets was that that was, by and large, simply not the case. And that, well, let me talk you through the complexities of it, because it was complex. One of the things we found was that schools' budgets were all over the place in terms of how much money different types of schools in different situations actually had to spend. So if you were a local authority school, you had one level of funding, but if you were an academy, you would have a very different level of funding, and if you were a relatively new start academy, not only would you get the top slice from the old local authority monies to help you on your way, but you would also get, in many cases, very substantial start-up funding. And it might be, actually, you were on a rolling start, so if you were completely new, so you didn't have all your year groups in, you just had a few year groups, and you were generously overfunded and overstaffed to allow you to get started. So you got that thing. And then you got things like, you know, if we came across one school that had had a sixth form, and sixth form numbers and funding had collapsed, and the place was in very serious financial trouble. And we had another school where, quite literally, the roof had fallen in, and the school was having desperately to try and find money to sort that sort of thing out. So the idea that schools were funded in a reasonably equal way, and then pupil premium was dropped on top of that, was simply not the case. They were in very different situations. So for some schools that were in a favourable budget situation, they could do all the things that either they'd previously been doing, or if they were new schools, that you might normally expect a school to do. And they then got pupil premium on top of that, and it was indeed new money. And they were able to say, well, what extra will we do with this new money? For the majority of schools, however, either they were scrabbling to try and make good losses in the funding that they had, or they were using pupil premium to backfill the money that they'd lost from the disappearance of other sources of funding. So you may remember at the time, all the kind of different streams of funding that there'd been under the Labour governments were more or less stopped, you know, or they were notionally rolled up into the overall school budget. But in fact, large amounts of them disappeared. Then pupil premium came in, and in many schools what it did was simply allow the school to carry on doing what it had done before. But it was not new money in that sense. Now again, you know, you might now tell me, oh no, because the pupil premium's gone up, actually we're now in a much more favourable situation, and it really is now feeling like new money. I'd be interested to know. I mean, there were other things, which is, if you want to know what's happening to schools' budgets, don't just look at the income stream. You've also got to look at what it is that schools have to pay for that they previously did not have to pay for. And what was happening at the time was local authority budgets were being eroded, and therefore local authority services were disappearing, and many of those services were targeted at precisely the same children, or more or less the same children, as those who are entitled to pupil premium. So even if the school overall had the same budget, it was now having to pay for things that previously it didn't have to pay for. Or equally commonly, what was happening was that schools were providing in-house things that had previously been provided as external services. Now again, you might say, oh no, that's all changed now, but that was the situation in 2012-13. So there was a real issue. It wasn't the schools, the majority of schools were not in financial difficulties, and therefore the government's promise to protect the school's budget was indeed, it would appear, being followed through. But there was no sense in which schools were kind of doing tap dances down the head was doing the tap dance down the school drive because all this extra money had come in. It just wasn't like that. And then the other thing that was also important was to look at the proportion of the school budget that Pupil Premium constituted. And at the time, it constituted somewhere between 1 and 3% of schools' budgets, on average. It will now, since the figures, since the money's gone up, it will be more than that. But the point is, even if you double that, what you are talking about is Pupil Premium as a relatively small contribution to schools' budgets. Now, head teachers were telling us, it's really welcome. Now, for goodness sake, don't take it away or we're in trouble. And they were also saying, actually, it's quite handy to have it hypothecated to a particular group of pupils, because it's really making us think, are we doing the sorts of things that we should be doing for that group of pupils? So they weren't saying it wasn't worth having, but if you actually look at the resources available schools to tackle the needs of their children, Pupil Premium is a rather small additional contribution to that. Whereas the impression being given in policy was that this was a big chunk of money that would allow schools to do wonderful things. Well, that's not the way that it was. There's more to say about money all the way through, but let's pass on at that point. Second thing, the idea that Pupil Premium allowed schools suddenly to set up provision for disadvantaged pupils was simply wrong. And that every school we went into already had substantial, elaborate, and we argued really quite sophisticated forms of provision for whatever the school defined as disadvantaged pupils. And we were slightly concerned that if you then introduced Pupil Premium and said, this money has to set up some new form of provision for disadvantaged pupils, and you have to show how the money supports this form of provision, that what that would do would be begin to unpick the quite well-developed and sophisticated patterns of provision that schools already had. And instead of having this elaborate form of provision that had been developed over years, that what would happen would be that would be dismantled. And in its place, you would get a lot of one-off interventions where you could show the money was spent to fund this intervention produced the following outcomes. And that wasn't how schools were working. Again, I'll say more about that as we go through. There's then the issue of the definition of disadvantage. And it was always clear that Pupil Premium was going to be attracted primarily by kids who were entitled to free school meals. And then you got into the looked after children, and you got into service children and so on. But the bulk of the money would be attracted by kids entitled to free school meals. Well, nothing new in that. Most local authority formulae for allocating monies, one of the major differentials is in relation to free school meals, and lots of other things related to disadvantage, but free school meals for long has been one of the things that you use. And it's actually not a bad indicator, because it's simple, and it's publicly available, and it's school related, and the data's in the schools, the data's in the system. It's not a bad way for shifting barrow loads of money around the system and getting them broadly to where they are needed. However, when we went into schools, they were by and large not using entitlement to free school meals as a means of defining disadvantage. They were defining disadvantage in educational terms. Who's actually not doing terribly well in this school? Who seems to have some sort of problems that look as though they call for us as a school to do something a bit different? That's who we spend our money on. Some of those kids, perhaps many of them, will be entitled to free school meals, but equally some, perhaps many, and in some schools the majority, will not be those who are entitled to free school meals. Because some of those kids entitled to free school meals are actually doing pretty well, thank you very much. Now, it seemed to us that, from the school's point of view, was a very reasonable position to be adopting. And there seemed to us to be as it became clearer that Ofsted in particular were expecting that pupil premium money would not only be attracted by kids entitled to free school meals, but would have to be spent on those kids, regardless of their educational status. It seemed to us that there was a very serious category error going on. Entitlement to free school meals is the measure, actually not a terribly good measure, but nonetheless, a good enough measure of a family's economic circumstances. It tells you absolutely nothing about a child's educational needs. So to say the money has to be spent simply because of the economic circumstances of the child seemed to us to be a very, very bizarre way of doing things. And schools, certainly at the time we were there, were struggling with that. And some were kind of saying, well, we've got no option, we've got to come quietly here, we've got to do what we're told. And others were saying, this is crazy. We know which kids in this school are not doing well. We know which kids we need to be spending money on. And if it's not the ones that Ofsted thinks we should be spending money on, then we'll have to battle it out. Or more accurately, what they said was, actually, pupil premium doesn't cover all the money we spend anyway on making provision for kids who we think have got some kinds of additional needs. We pool pupil premium with a lot of other money to do a whole range of things. If Ofsted want to be told what it is that pupil premium is spent on, and want to be assured that it's spent on kids entitled to free school meals, okay, we'll do that. What we'll do is pick out of all the things we do, those things that target kids entitled to free school meals, and we'll tell Ofsted that's what we're spending pupil premium on. It won't be a lie, because pupil premium's pooled with lots of other money, and therefore it is spent on that. But the reality is it's spent on a lot of other things, and other money's spent. So that seemed to be the way that things were going. And I have to say, the definition of disadvantage, as schools were offering it to us, seemed to make much more educational sense than a notion that you spend money on an economically defined category. You'll have your own views. You may say, no, that's no longer a problem. What was also interesting was that schools not only had quite elaborate forms of provision for children who were regarded as disadvantaged, they were often based on really quite sophisticated rationales. Schools had thought quite hard about what they were trying to do and why they were trying to do it. Now, some of that was in a form that could be recognised within the pupil premium policy as it unfolded. In other words, here is a child who, is a level below where this child notionally ought to be in whatever the measure was, whatever the subject area was. Therefore, we will put in place an intervention, which in the short term we hope will boost the little so-and-so up a little bit and get them closer to where notionally they ought to be. So, yes, there were those kinds of very targeted interventions. But we also got told what to us seemed like a much more sophisticated story in schools, which is we serve a population that is disadvantaged. There are certain characteristics of many of the children and many of the families in this area. And it might be to do with a narrowness of experience. Here we got kids who just never leave the estate or the few streets where they happen to live. They just don't get a breadth of experience. Or here we've got kids who experience material poverty, and as they come into school, if we're not careful, they get put off school because they haven't got, the PE kit or the uniform or the equipment or whatever else it may be. Or we've got a lot of families here where, however supportive the families are, the parents do not have the necessary know-how to support their children's education effectively. So we have to work with the parents. So that we got those kinds of stories about what the population was like, what different groups of kids were like. And a kind of thoughtful analysis of what you would have to do to put those things right. What you would have to do might indeed include some very targeted, short-term interventions. But it might also mean thinking more deeply about the long-term needs and issues in the population that the school was serving. So the schools, we thought, had really quite sophisticated rationales. Now, we couldn't test them out, but in terms of the robustness of the account, we were really quite impressed with those things. The schools we went to varying extents, also had really good monitoring systems. They knew their pupils, and they knew who was doing well and who wasn't, but they knew a lot more than that as well. They knew a lot about family circumstances, they knew about behavioural issues, they knew all sorts of things about the children in their care. And this wasn't the kind of knowledge that stayed in teachers' heads. This was knowledge that was recorded in, very often, in some kind of a monitoring system. And not only that, when the schools, in many cases I would say, when the schools were trying to do something to tackle the issues these children were facing, they were able to say, well look, this is where this child was when we started, and this is where they are now. And let's look at the group we did this with. This is where they were, this is where they are now. This seems to be pretty good prima facie evidence that what we are doing is working. So they were able to do some kind of what seemed to us, given the limitations of what is ever possible to do in school, seemed to us to be doing some really quite robust evaluations of the kinds of initiatives they were taking. So the monitoring systems, again, we thought, in schools we went to, were really quite impressive. Now, that's not to say every school had an impressive monitoring system. We were going to schools that had welcomed us in to look at how they were using Pupil Premium. Maybe we found 34 schools that were the only 34 schools in the country that knew what they were doing. We suspected not. We suspected not. Okay. There was something about heads, governors and parents which is less, I suppose, supportive of schools, though it indicated some of the issues that schools were facing. Decisions about Pupil Premium were effectively made by head teachers. Governors were scarcely involved, and there were real issues about involving parents. Some of them as yet hadn't got their parental report up on the website. Some of them had got parents involved and then were wondering what can of worms they'd opened, because they were finding parents coming to them and saying, well, if my kids are entitled to free school meals, therefore they have X £100 allocated to them, this is how I would like that X £100 to be spent on my child, please, which was not quite what the school was trying to do. So there were some issues around that. Now again, towards the end of the period, because it was rapidly changing, schools were beginning to get, not necessarily parents more directly involved, but were certainly beginning to get governors more directly involved. So it wasn't just all on the head say so. And if you put all this together, given what I've said, schools had, at the time, had a lot of concerns about what the introduction of Pupil Premium was doing to their established provision. And basically they were saying, yes, we like the initiative, yes, it is indeed getting us to think about what we do, but actually, we do know what we're doing here, and yet we're being told, and we're particularly by Ofsted, we're being told that what we're doing is the wrong thing to do, and we shouldn't be doing these interventions. We should be doing the ones that are in the Pupil Premium toolkit. We shouldn't be pooling the budget. We should be keeping it separate. We shouldn't be spending it on kids we think are disadvantaged. We should spend it on the kids who attract Pupil Premium. And there were very significant tensions being experienced by schools. Some were very confident, and saying, we know what we do, we've got good reason to do it, so we're going to keep on doing it. Others were beginning to say, we can't fight this, so we're going to have to stop doing the things we have done and start doing the things we're told. And of course, we didn't follow this up, but it'd be interesting to find out from you. If you say a lot of the other budgetary elements that support disadvantage will disappear and replaced by Pupil Premium, if you then say that Pupil Premium could only be spent on kids entitled, who are attracted, namely those entitled to free school meals, what presumably was going to happen was that provision for other kids whose schools who thought were disadvantaged was going to have to be eroded in order that the money could be spent on a target group, some, and in some cases many of whom, schools didn't think needed that kind of provision. Now again, you might tell me, oh no, those fears were unfounded, that's not what's happened at all, we've got it all sorted out, and this was just a transition phase. That is entirely possible. But let's talk then about some of the broader issues around how you target disadvantage, how you spend money, and what it means to use an evidence-based approach to tackling disadvantage. There's some key issues. Who counts as disadvantaged? Who's disadvantaged in your schools? Is it kids entitled to free school meals? Is it all of them? Is it some of them? Is it a wider group? Who counts as disadvantaged? You know, in the sense that they need some extra money spent. Then, what do we do? Do we do direct attacks on low attainment? And, you know, the term interventions was unheard of in schools 5-10 years ago. Now, whenever I go near a school, I trip over interventions wherever I go. And what they mean are short-term, targeted, usually additional teaching to get some kid up a level, or a bit of a level, but to that kind of short-term approach. Well, what do we do? Do we do those kind of direct attainment-related attacks? Or do we take a more holistic view to what at one time was known barriers to learning? So, for instance, should school be working with parents? Or should it say, well, hang on, parents are not attainment, we can only work on attainment. So instead of working with families and parents, we must just put an additional bit of teaching in the classroom. At the time, there was the big thing about classroom assistants. And you recall, at the time, the message was waste of time. Absolute waste of time, don't do anything, they don't have an impact on the children. And yet the schools were saying, well, hang on, we can use our classroom assistants really well, and we're pretty clear that, you know, they do all sorts of things for kids, and they have an impact on attainment as well. But do we abandon that in order to have something where we've got what seems to be some kind of evidence that this makes a difference to attainment? This comes from pretty much the same thing. You know, do we have these interventions that are not connected one with another? So you're a bit behind on this, have an intervention on that. Oh, your attendance is a bit poor as well, let's have an attendance intervention. Ah, your behaviour's a bit wrong as well, let's have a behaviour intervention. Or is there something more to do with, well, how does this school relate to its pupils, relate to families? What kind of ethos do we have in the school? How do we teach in ordinary classes and ordinary classrooms, as well as what do we add on to those things? There's another one I haven't mentioned, which is that many of the previous sources of money that schools had had access to required schools to work together, or encouraged schools to work together, and very often to pool budgets, or, you know, the budget was withheld centrally, held by the local authority, and schools could only get access to it if they worked within some kind of a framework. What Pupil Premium is individual school oriented. So it's all the money that had been used for collective purposes was divvied out to individual schools. And what we found was that there were different effects, but in some cases certainly the kind of collective approaches that schools had actually been quite positive about were beginning to fall to pieces. Because individual schools got their pot of money and said, hey, this is our money, we're off. No, we won't put it into that collective endeavour. Not always. In some cases, the opposite was beginning to happen. So, we just can't get enough educational psychology support from the local authority anymore, because the local authority's finances are in chaos. So a group of us have pulled together to buy our own educational psychology support. There's some of that going on. But how do you tackle disadvantage? Do you do it school by school, intervention by intervention, or do you need a more holistic, collective approach? And then, remember the Pupil Premium policy was based on the notion school leaders know best. And yet, when it was introduced, it was followed up almost immediately by very, very rigid central guidance as to how exactly this money should be spent. In other words, school leaders haven't got the faintest idea what they're doing until Michael Wilshaw tells them what to do. Then they might have a clue. And if they don't, we'll punish them anyway. But I mean, so how do you there's a real issue here in terms of how you respond to educational disadvantage. Is it something that people on the ground in schools know about? Or will, if you allow them their head, will they simply waste resources and fail to tackle disadvantage? And therefore you've got to do it centrally. And I think there are two models which will have been becoming obvious as I'm talking. One is a very focused model where you tackle disadvantage by identifying categories of pupils, targeting those categories very tightly. You don't allow the money to be spent on anything that doesn't have a more or less immediate impact on children's attainment. You use proven interventions. You come up with something like the Pupil Premium Toolkit, and you say, this tells you the dozen things that work, so you better do these dozen things and not do other things that you have been doing previously where we haven't got that kind of, quotes, robust research evidence to support it. So you've only proven interventions, schools acting alone, and I think what I'd say about that is that will, if you follow that approach, if nationally we follow that approach, there is a high chance that we will have short-term impacts. I used to be, you won't remember this, but I used to be something called a remedial teacher. So I used to take kids out of classrooms, put them in a broom cupboard somewhere and teach them phonics. And I'd teach them for a term, and at the end of the term they would know more phonics than they did at the beginning. Right? So it's very targeted. You'd identify the kids very precisely. You'd have an intervention, and I kind of half knew what I was doing in the intervention. If I didn't, I got a book that followed the book. And in the short term, I'd get an impact from that. And I'd think, well, that's very good. Test them before, test them after. The better after than before, it must be working. And then all the research evidence came out on approaches of that sort that said, yeah, you do get a short-term impact. But go back a few months later, and the kids are just back where they were. Because you've tackled the kind of short-term issue. You haven't tackled the underlying problems that are preventing this child from learning effectively in normal classroom circumstances. You haven't tackled their limited language experience. You haven't tackled what goes on in the home. You haven't tackled the way that ordinary classroom teaching is just alienating for this child. So you've given them a quick boost, they go forward, and they fall back. And we've fallen into, you could argue, we've fallen in this country in recent years into the mistake of having a constant succession of little boosts. Have a little boost, you've fallen behind. Have another little boost, you've fallen behind again. And it looks as though what you get from that is short-term impact, certainly, but unless you've got something that then hooks into that short-term impact in the longer term, and that deals with underlying problems, in the long term, you are unlikely to get transformations. And if you don't believe me, those of you who are in secondary schools, tell your primary colleagues what happens to kids when you come into secondary school, and you look at what they're supposed to do, be able to do what level they're supposed to be at, and you find out that they're not at that level. And then if there are any of you here working post-16 education, you tell me how you get these kids from secondary schools, and they're supposed to be able to do X, Y, and Z, but when you actually put them in your environment, they fall to pieces and they can't do it at all. It's short-term impacts, long-term, not much difference made. So there's an issue about that. And then there's another issue, which is a systemic issue, which is basically, this is, some of you will remember Bronfenbrenner, and the idea of children developing in an ecology. And, you know, the school, here's the child, the school is part of that ecology, but it's only part, because there's all sorts of other things going on in the child's life, not least the family and the neighbourhood and the context in which the child's growing. And that actually, if you are serious about helping children from disadvantaged circumstances do well educationally, it's no good just looking at a little intervention, not even the whole school, but a kind of, here you are, have 6 weeks of this. That's not going to make the difference. You've got to work across the whole of the child's ecology, and that's a difficult thing to do. So this more systemic approach responds to the idea of need rather than just focusing on disadvantage as defined economically. It focuses on multiple outcomes because different domains of outcomes for children are interrelated. So, you know, how well they do in terms of the personal development is related to their attainment. How well they do in terms of health and well-being is related to personal development and attainment. What their life chances are going to be like in terms of employment are related to. All of these things are related, so you can't tackle one in isolation. You've got to tackle the whole lot. And it uses context-driven approaches. In other words, it's looking at the whole ecology. That means that schools can't do it on their own, much less do it by little interventions outside the classroom. Now, all of that has an impeccable rationale, given what we know about how disadvantage works. The problem is that it isn't so good at generating short-term impacts. And that's not very good when at the end of the year, or, you know, 24 hours after a phone call, a school could be held to account for what have its short-term impacts been. It's not very good at that. But it does have a higher chance of long-term transformation. So, there's the two models. My view, for what it's worth, is that the best bet is a kind of hybrid approach. That the dominant approach I think we should be adopting, and where all the evidence points us, is to that systemic approach, that long-term, holistic approach, rather than that short-term, highly targeted approach. But, of course, there needs to be a focus on attainment. The idea that attainment is everything, if what we mean is test passing, it isn't even the most important educational outcome, let alone how you'd want children to be generally. It doesn't tell you what children know and can do, it says whether they can pass a test or not. So, yes, it's important, but it can't be everything. Yes, we need to use indicators of disadvantage, like free school meals, but the idea that they give us an accurate picture of who's doing well and who isn't is nonsense. There's no scrap of research evidence that says that. What the research evidence says is that as a group, children from economically poorer backgrounds do worse educationally than, as a group, children from more advantaged backgrounds do. However, that tells you absolutely nothing about what happens at the individual level. So, are there kids who come from economically poor backgrounds who do well educationally? Yeah, there's loads of them. Are there kids who come from economically more favourable educational backgrounds who do badly in education? Yeah, loads of them. So don't mistake the two categories. Right? So use the indicators as a guide. We better look what our kids entitled to free school meals are doing, but not as a straitjacket where we say, regardless of how well they're doing, that's where we're spending our money. That's crazy. That then means that we need a particular kind of evidence which comes from the detailed monitoring of individual pupils at school level and from the detailed monitoring of the effects of interventions at school level. It's important that schools do that. And what we should be doing is not telling schools what to do. We should be supporting schools in finding out how best to use their resources and how best to monitor the impacts of what they're doing. There's almost none of that going on, but there's a lot of do this, do that, do this. That's not the most effective way. And I think I'd also put into that just a caveat about research evidence, as it is in the Pupil Premium Toolkit, for instance. And if you read the Pupil Premium Toolkit, you will see this caveat writ large in there. And if ever you go to a talk by Steve Higgins, who's led the development of the Pupil Premium Toolkit, he will say this, which is research evidence is brilliant at telling you what happens in general. It is rubbish at telling you what happens in particular circumstances. The research has always been done somewhere other than in your context at this time. So it's something that's a very powerful guide, but it's actually not a good instructor in terms of telling you precisely what to do. I go back to that, what happened with the teaching assistant thing, that at first Pupil Premium Toolkit came out, schools all over the place were using teaching assistants. Pupil Premium Toolkit said, waste of money, give or take. Broadly, waste of money. Schools are saying, hang on, that doesn't fit with our experience. Then the Education Endowment Foundation, that's doing research to amplify the Pupil Premium Toolkit, has a project that says, oh no, we found actually under certain circumstances teaching assistants are actually pretty good. So the first guidance we gave is actually not now any longer effective guidance. Now that's what happens in research. The research begins to look like it's saying one thing, and then you do it in a different context, in a different way, you get a slightly different message, and you have to balance it. Research will never tell you exactly what to do. It'll be a very, very useful guide, but it's never something you can follow to the letter. It has to be done in context. And so what we would say is, or what I would say is, you need a systemic approach in which you have collaborative efforts to tackle not just low attainment, but to tackle the underlying causes of low attainment in terms of what's happening in terms of children's lives and their families and their communities, and to tackle the poverty that actually is the root cause of all this. And there's a phrase that's used in health when they talk about health inequalities. And they say you don't treat health inequalities by getting doctors to do something different or nurses to give different injections. You tackle health inequalities by looking at the causes of those inequalities and indeed the causes of the causes. Now, I'm running out of time on this, but let me just alert you to some work we're doing currently that you might want to follow. We're doing some work with Save the Children to try and put these ideas into practice, and we're developing some things. They're now called children's communities, but originally they were called children's zones, and the report there, if you can't read the title, it's called Developing Children's Zones for England. So if you Google that, you'll get hold of our report, where we're saying, okay, what we need is not individual schools with little interventions. We may have some of that, but we need groups of schools working collaboratively. And we need groups of schools working with other partners, not just focusing narrowly on attainment, but looking at how we work across the whole of children's life. And we need that in areas of disadvantage to be done on an area and neighbourhood scale, so that we can come up with a strategic approach to tackle not just the immediate issue, which is attainment, but the causes of poor attainment and the causes of the causes of poor attainment. I can't go into fine detail of what we're doing there, but if that sounds interesting to you, have a look at that report and see